Welcome to tonight's Terror, where you can expect original scary stories. Nothing here is written or narrated by AI. If you enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for visiting, and enjoy the story.
The minute I answered my dad's phone call, I knew something was wrong. He used the voice that had the strain and forced calm I recognized as the preamble to bad news. Then it came. My great-uncle Charlie had suffered a stroke the night before. You're likely thinking, great-uncle? Did you even know him? I did. My dad knew him even better. Charlie had raised my father from the age of 10 after a car accident had taken his parents. I listened as my dad relayed the details of the night in a somber, tired voice. Charlie was going to have to spend some time in the hospital, and with luck, later be moved to a care facility. As the days passed, my father and I visited Charlie. I found myself sitting beside his bed for hours every day. I'd play his favorite music, Tom Waits, Leonard Cohen, from my phone, and read him the news on his beloved New York Mets. I was around 30 when this all happened. The month before, I'd been laid off from my job and hadn't found anything new yet. I would never say I was grateful for the distraction that Charlie's stroke provided, but I was grateful for the timing. My dad couldn't be at the hospital all the time, and with no work, I could make up the difference. It felt good to give myself over completely to a worthy cause, and Charlie was certainly that. He'd given up a life of bachelorhood, travel, and disposable income when he adopted my father. He was a lot of things, sure. No one's perfect. But he was a good man. My dad was touring a care facility one morning while I stayed at the hospital and sat with Charlie. He hadn't spoken since the stroke. I was flipping through the TV channels, trying to read Charlie's eyes for the flicker of recognition that meant I'd landed on the right one, when the neurologist stepped quietly into the room. I'd met him a few times before. He was tall and handsome in a Clark Kent sort of way. Looking at him, standing there beside the bathroom, I half expected him to dash in while pulling off his glasses and coat. The Superman theme didn't play, but he did take off his glasses. He folded them and held them in his hands, now crossed in front of his belt. In past conversations, he'd been very upbeat, speaking brightly of Charlie's recovery. Today it was clear we'd reached a backstop of some kind. There was no optimism to be found in his face. He spoke to me, even though Charlie was there beside me. As you know, Charlie has suffered a basilar artery stroke. The condition he finds himself in now is commonly known as locked-in syndrome. I must have worn a befuddled expression because he quickly clarified. Your uncle is unlikely to recover his ability to speak. His motor functions may slowly return, but at his age, I'm not optimistic about that either. However, he is in there. He can hear you. He can think and feel as he always has. He just can't move. He's locked in. I turned to Charlie. His eyes were cast up at the ceiling. There was no readable expression I could discern. The muscles of his face were almost entirely useless to him. From time to time, I'd see a twitch of movement in his jaw, but that was about it. I wanted to cry as I thought of how he must have been feeling as he heard this news. How trapped inside his body he now knew he'd always be. Over the next 20 minutes, I did my best to take notes on my phone and ask practical questions of the doctor. I knew my dad would want to have this meeting all over again when he returned later that afternoon, but it was the only thing I could think to do beyond nodding dumbly. From time to time, I'd hear a rushed breath or a sigh from Charlie behind me. I moved to sit on the bedside so I could squeeze his hand. It was clear to all of us that he was still in there, cognitively. I was becoming reasonably nimble at reading his eyes, the little they could tell me. Today, though, I couldn't take anything from his gaze. As the doctor's instructions stretched on, Charlie closed his eyes. 2 hours later, my dad and I sat across from one another at a table in a chain restaurant we both hated. We'd eaten here 3 times in the last 2 weeks, and my distaste had only grown with each visit. It was the nearest thing to the hospital that wasn't fast food, so there we were. We each nursed a beer without saying much. While my dad was in the restroom, I ordered us each a chicken breast sandwich, the least alarming item on the menu from a coronary standpoint. When he sat down, his voice had the bad news hype man quality again. He forced a smile and asked, "You think this place could cater my birthday?" He lifted his hand and gestured to the ridiculous decor hanging on the walls and over the bar. A mounted deer head wearing a cowboy hat looked on. I ignored him. "I think we're past the let me down easy phase, Dad. What's going on?" He let out a long exhale and frowned deeply in the pitiful way we do when we know we're helpless. "Your uncle can't afford any of the care facilities I've visited. Not even close." "Where does that leave him? There has to be an option." "What about Sandra?" I responded incredulously. We didn't say Uncle Charlie's ex-wife's name out loud very often. She'd stuck around for a few years after Charlie had taken in my dad, but eventually everyone agreed she needed to move on. She was younger than Charlie and didn't want children. Back then, she'd been addicted to some kind of prescription drug. She still existed somewhere, skulking in the orbit of Charlie's life, but I hadn't seen her in years. "Her?" my dad said with a sarcastic laugh. "Give me a break. Last time Charlie mentioned her, it was because she turned up begging him for money. Forget about it." "Well then, what?" He shook his head, as if to clear the image of the ex-wife. "There are options. I've read up on them online. But I'll be honest, I don't think either of us are going to be okay leaving him in these places. They're pretty basic. In fact, the word grim comes to mind. If what I saw online is the way these places choose to market themselves, I worry the reality of living in them is far worse," he concluded gloomily. I bit my bottom lip and looked up at the ceiling fan as it spun lazily. My dad spoke again. "I had an idea." Just then the waitress glided up beside us with our meals. As if she could feel our disdain for her workplace, she flopped the plates down hard enough to draw looks from the next table. By way of apology, she murmured, "Enjoy," her back already turned. "This place is a real gem," I snarked, looking down at my sandwich. A sad-looking scrap of lettuce hung from the bun, like a flag signaling the bland flavors within. Ignoring me, my dad carried on. "What if you moved in with Uncle Charlie and looked after him? You're not working right now, and there's a state program that could compensate you for acting as his caretaker." I must have looked doubtful, because he pressed on, now with the tone of a salesman. "I already looked into it. The program would be a legitimate income, and we wouldn't have to worry about the quality of care he'd be getting." "What about professionals?" I asked. "I'm not a doctor. I'm not a nurse." "His insurance would cover the cost of a nurse coming in a few times a week." I took a bite of my sandwich and chewed the overcooked, leathery chicken slowly, mostly to stall and think about what my dad had said. I was 30, unemployed, and single. Taking on the role as full-time carer for an elderly relative seemed like a surefire way to maintain both those little status symbols. "So, what do you think?" my dad asked, eyebrows raised expectantly. "What if I do it for a while? And if it's a disaster, we revisit the care facilities," I offered, only half sure of the words as I spoke them. He lifted his beer and tilted it in my direction in a mock toast. "Absolutely. I was going to suggest the same thing. I'd been living in one of Charlie's guest rooms for about 3 weeks when I began to get truly comfortable with our routine. I can spare you the details of dressing, feeding, and cleaning him. However, I don't think I was half bad at the job. My only complaint was one that racked me with guilt. I was lonely. I spent almost every waking hour in the company of a man I knew well, but since his stroke, it was a lot like being alone. I talked to Charlie all day and watched his eyes to see if he found the comment I'd made funny, interesting, or maybe exasperating. A few times I caught myself asking him a question like, "This rain is going to let up eventually, don't you think?" Then I'd offer a sheepish apology. As the days and weeks passed, I began to know his home well. Every foot of carpet, every cupboard handle, every muttering belch from the furnace as it kicked on in the night, all familiar to me. I think it was this well-worn routine and the sense of familiarity that made it so easy to notice something out of place. Footprints. I felt paranoid even making note of it at the time, but I saw footprints pressed into the shag carpet of Charlie's living room, the room we spent most of our time in during the day. They were visible for just a few feet between the computer desk and the closet. I think I noticed them because I never spent any time there. I didn't use the old desktop computer. Out of boredom, I vacuumed the house a few times a week. That was why the carpet always had a nice, combed appearance. That is until I walked on it or rolled Charlie's chair over it. But the circuit for Charlie's wheelchair was pretty simple. Bedroom to living room, to window, to bathroom, repeat. I'd been staring at the curious prints in the rug for a few minutes before I shook myself loose from the trance and decided to get on with the day. Charlie had been at the window, watching the birds at his feeders for a while. Probably too long. "Hey, Uncle Chuck," I greeted him warmly as I always did when I'd left him on his own for more than a few minutes. I pulled his chair back from the picture window and gingerly lifted him from his chair into his dark green leather recliner. He couldn't have weighed more than 150 pounds. I did my best to ignore it because it felt morbid, but I caught myself tracking his decline based on how easy it was becoming to lift him. As his head rested against the chair, I studied his face. He couldn't turn his head, of course, but he could control his eyes. And they were darting left and then rolling back to me. His pale blue eyes did this again and again. It looked almost involuntary, like a spasm. "You okay, Chuck? You want to go back to the window?" His eyes finally stopped their wild dance and he focused on my face intensely. "You're going to ask the nurse about that, huh?" I concluded. I'd grown more thick-skinned about Charlie's condition during the last month. Early on, I'd panicked and called the doctor for anything even remotely out of the ordinary. An odd noise in his breath, constipation, loss of appetite. I decided I could wait until Friday for the nurse's next visit to ask about this little ocular oddity. That night, Charlie and I sat in the living room after I'd cleaned up dinner. He was in his recliner, and I continued to wear a divot in the couch cushion I'd come to favor. The big subway chase scene was coming up in one of Charlie's favorite movies, The French Connection. At that part, I'd always sneak a look over to Charlie's face to watch his eyes focus and light on the screen. I couldn't even guess at how often he'd watched Gene Hackman chase that drug smuggler, only to see him come up empty every time. Nevertheless, when I'd scroll through titles on the screen, at least once every few weeks his eyes would tell me that this is the one he wanted to watch. When Detective Doyle ran off through the abandoned warehouse and the credits crept along the screen, I saw Charlie's eyes had closed. I skipped the wheelchair and carried him to his bed. After I'd taken off his slippers and tucked his blanket around him, I slipped out of his room and quietly shut the door. When I stepped into the living room again, I was struck by a strange sensation. It was that feeling you get when you walk into a room, and it's like you've just missed people talking about you, saying your name. But there was no one there. The room was quiet and empty. I stood, listening. I stared into each corner of the room. With just one floor lamp on, the space was dimly lit, and it took me a moment to feel certain I wasn't missing anything. I tried to ignore the bizarre sensation that I wasn't alone. This wasn't the first time I'd felt this way in Charlie's house, particularly as I was getting used to the way the house sounded when everything was quiet at night. It was easy to dismiss the phenomenon in those instances, but tonight was different. I hadn't heard anything. I just felt like someone was in the house, or just had been. I decided to grab a beer from the kitchen and do some job hunting on my laptop. As I returned with my drink and computer, I noticed what had eluded me before: the computer desk chair. It was turned around. The seat, always pushed into the desk, had been swiveled out and sat facing the room. I stood, beer in hand, staring down at the chair. I was afraid to move, as though one wrong step would trigger whatever terrible fate the disturbed chair portended. After a moment, I gave the chair a bump with my hip. It rotated drowsily back toward the old computer. The arm of the chair bounced off the lip of the desk and halted its progress. I swallowed hard and leapt back from the desk to get a look underneath. A trash can and a plastic bin of orphaned cables sat in the darkness below. Setting my beer and laptop on the desk, I bumped the mouse. The screen lit immediately, bathing the room with the light of Charlie's desktop image. It was him and my dad, each one holding a tiny fish they'd caught and laughing. A brilliant blue body of water, probably Otsego Lake, lay behind them. I hadn't touched Charlie's computer since moving in. I had no need for it. It was a bit of a dinosaur, one of those tower CPUs, and the 100-pound monitor to match. "What are you doing on?" I said, to the glowing screen. It had obviously been idling with the screen asleep until I bumped it. I felt awful doing it, and I told myself I'd never tell a soul if I came across something embarrassing. But I opened the internet browser. Netscape? Come on, Charlie. And pulled up the search history. I was relieved to find nothing even faintly lurid or scandalous. It appeared to be a series of searches on Charlie's condition. My dad must have been using the computer. I saw searches on stroke recovery, diet, stroke warning signs, drug side effects, and then life expectancy. Yikes, Dad, I thought morbidly. The guilt of invading Charlie's privacy as he slept in the next room overcame me. I quickly shut down the computer and tucked the chair back under the desk. A loud thump from outside broke the silence. I flinched and dropped my beer to the floor. I looked toward the front of the house. Through the vertical windows flanking the door, I saw a figure. He was kneeling, almost out of sight. Suddenly he stood. The familiar vest of an Amazon driver came into view. I exhaled and ran my hand through my hair. I needed a drink. I jogged to the kitchen and returned with a handful of paper towels. I crouched and began sopping up the beer from the carpet. From that angle, I saw more impressions in the carpet. The prints were smaller than mine. They led away from the computer desk in the direction of the wall. I followed them with my eyes, then looked up at the closet door. It was one of those bifold style doors that houses from the 1970s always seemed to have. It had those wooden slats all the way up that you could turn sideways to open. Someone had walked from the computer desk to the closet. All at once, I felt certain that someone was indeed watching me. I stood, without taking my eyes off the closet door. Taking 2 big steps back, I pulled my phone from my pocket and typed 911. I didn't hit call. I reached out with my foot and gave the closet door a light kick. I don't know what I expected to happen, but nothing did. "Is someone in there?" I said in a firm, even voice that belied my terror. I waited, struggling to arrest my breathing as I strained to listen for movement. I imagined one of the wooden door slats slowly pivoting, exposing a pair of eyes fixed on me. But nothing happened. I stood, phone in hand, listening for what felt like 10 minutes. Finally, I tucked the phone back in my pocket and reached for the doorknob. In a wild motion, I tore the door wide open. The closet was empty. Well, it was unoccupied. I was looking at an upholstery steamer and a few old pairs of Charlie's boots. As I lay in bed that night, I read up on the phenomenon known as gaze perception, the animal ability to recognize that you're being watched. However, I soon learned that if a person is just imagining that they're being watched, it's called illusory gaze perception. Laying my phone on the nightstand, I decided that tonight my perception had been firmly illusory. Over the next 2 days, I noticed more oddities around the house. It reached the point that I began a list on my phone's Notes app. 1. Footprints on the rug. 2. Turned swivel chair. 3. Computer left on. 4. Basement light left on. 5. Cigarette butt in the driveway. 6. One beer missing from the fridge. No empty bottle in the recycling bin. 7. Back door unlocked. 8. Charlie's pill organizer left open. I still have that list. I look at it from time to time and wonder how I ever doubted my instincts. How I could have ever been so stupid. I suppose I was able to convince myself that these things could have been mindless and forgotten acts on my part. The cigarette could have been the delivery driver. The beer really needled me, though. I couldn't remember whether or not I drank it, so fair enough. But I couldn't account for its absence in the recycling bin. I decided to call my dad. I think I just wanted someone to talk me down. Charlie's locked-in syndrome must have been hell for him. This minor unease and discomfort didn't hold a candle to his suffering. But the job was hard on me when I needed someone who could hold a conversation, talk back. A few minutes later, I'd nearly finished retracing the events of the last couple days and nights. "And I can't find the beer bottle anywhere, Dad. I always rinse them in the sink and put them in recycling." My dad was quiet for a beat and then asked, "How are you sleeping?" "Sleeping? Fine. I mean, it takes me a little while to nod off lately because I'm so damn paranoid about every bump and tick the house makes." He continued in a soothing parental tone. "I think the isolation is getting to you. I know you're not alone, but you know what I mean. You want a few days off? I can come and stay." I sat on the couch while Charlie rested in the recliner beside me. His eyes started that sharp zigzag to the left again. I stood up and stepped onto the front stoop. His conversation was heading somewhere I didn't want him to witness. "Honestly, Dad, yes. Maybe just the weekend. Thank you." "Sure thing, bud. I just need to cancel an appointment for later this afternoon. I'll pack a bag." "No, don't do that," I protested. "Come tomorrow. I'm fine for one more night. Truly." We ended the call with a plan in place. That made me feel a little bit more at ease. I stood on the porch a bit longer, letting the snap and bite of the February wind chill me. It struck me that my dad had expertly navigated our phone call so that he didn't have to minimize my fears about the strange happenings in the house. He'd also dodged each attempt I'd made to have him affirm them. As I stood, squinting into the wind, something caught my eye. Movement across the street. The blue house opposite Charlie's had an attached garage. I thought I saw someone looking out of the row of garage door windows. I could see the outline of a head and shoulders. This only piqued my interest because I thought the house was empty. The for sale sign had been up all the weeks I'd been living here. The person stood, motionless, for a long moment, until I was almost convinced I wasn't looking at a person at all. But then the figure faded back and away from the window until they were swallowed by the darkness of the garage's interior. "Okay, then," I said, with mock cheeriness in my voice. I took one last breath of fresh air and stepped back inside. The mournful trumpet of Tom Waits' Closing Time wandered through the house. Charlie loved that whole album. In the past, Tom Waits had always sounded to me like he had gravel in his throat. After sitting with Charlie and listening to his albums again and again, I had to admit, I'd fallen in love with the wistful, smoky music. Charlie was where I had left him, of course. He was sleeping or resting his eyes as the music filled the space around him. When Closing Time ended, he opened his eyes and looked up at me. I was about to say, "Hey, Chuck," as I always did, when I noticed his eyes were filled with tears. I knelt beside the recliner and covered his hand with mine. The impulse to ask what was wrong was overwhelming, but I knew that asking questions he couldn't answer must have frustrated him endlessly. So I just stayed where I was, holding his hand for a long time. Eventually, he closed his eyes again. Soon, I heard the familiar rhythms of sleep in his breath. I put in my earbuds and listened to an audiobook while I cleaned the kitchen. I always favored crime thrillers, but today the tension and violence of the story wasn't sitting well. I paused the book and carried on with dishes in silence. The sun was nearly gone as I closed the dishwasher and hit the start button. In the living room, Charlie was awake again, his eyes cast upward, seemingly not focused on anything at all. Something was troubling him. Not his condition, something new. I stood in front of him, smiling a tight-lipped smile, but managed to stop before he saw me. I knew that smile. It was a pitying, patronizing smile. No one likes that smile. When Charlie finally looked at me, I spoke. "I found a YouTube channel with classic Mets games. They've got Game 6 from the '86 series with the Red Sox. Interested?" He closed his eyes for a long blink. For a while now, I'd understood this to be a hard no. "Okay, how about a movie? Who's up next? Jack Nicholson? How about Chinatown?" Another long blink. "One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. The Last Detail? 5 Easy Pieces." Charlie's eyes popped open with an intensity I hadn't seen from him, maybe ever, certainly since the stroke. Immediately he began darting his eyes to the left. Again and again, they rolled over and back, like someone was shaking a doll. Gaze perception struck all at once. I heard a ringing in my ears. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I felt the overwhelming sensation that someone was looking at me from somewhere, unseen. Now, my eyes were peeled open wide. I stared wildly around the room. Nothing seemed amiss. Finally, I looked back at Charlie. I stopped searching his eyes for meaning and followed them. To Charlie's left, to my right. Once again, I was staring at the bifold closet doors. Once again, I felt sure someone was inside. I turned, simultaneously feeling in my pocket for my phone. Empty. The image of my phone laying beside my earbuds on the kitchen counter flashed painfully in my mind. I took one step toward the kitchen without breaking my gaze on the closet. Then, the door moved. Just a minute slide of one panel, no more than an inch, leaving a vertical strip of darkness where the folding doors met. "Charlie," I said. It was almost a whimper. In that voice, I heard the little boy version of me, suddenly vulnerable and afraid, some part of my subconscious begging my helpless uncle to protect me. The doors burst open. A few of the wood slats splintered with a sharp crack. A figure leapt from the darkness with shocking speed. It was a woman, clad in a teal nightgown. She charged at me, unleashing a scream that was a twisted blend of agony and rage. I stood frozen in horror. As she closed in, I couldn't even see a head. Her hair was a mass of gray and red tangles swarming over her face. Before I could raise my arms to block her, she clubbed me on the side of the head with her forearm. It wasn't as painful as it was shocking. Frightened and unsteady as I was, it took an effort to not topple over onto Charlie. The woman tore past me and out the front door. I darted to the door and locked it. My heart still pounding, I watched her through the window. She shot a wary glance over her shoulder as she hurried down the driveway and shuffled across the street. I only got one good look at her face, but it was enough. She didn't stop when she reached the other side of the street. She paced confidently up the driveway in front of the blue house and let herself in the side door of the garage. She had to know I could see her, but I got the distinct impression she didn't care. In a daze, I stalked back to Charlie's chair. He gazed up at me from his green recliner. His stare was focused and steady. "Charlie," I began before pausing. I looked to the front door again and back to him. Then I broke my rule about asking Charlie questions. "Was that your ex-wife?" He blinked over and over, as fast as I'd ever seen him manage. Sandra. It had all been Sandra. As I dialed the police, I thought over the chain of unexplained incidents in the house. She had hidden herself in that closet at some point. She'd used the computer. She'd drank a beer, smoked a cigarette. Though it shocked me, I supposed Charlie must have given her a key. Or maybe she'd stolen a spare. When the police arrived, they didn't even come to our house. They parked across the street, and within a few moments they led Sandra, in her nightgown and slippers, out of the garage. Her wild, staring eyes were stretched open, watering in the brisk air. Perhaps she was crying, but I didn't read much sorrow or regret in her expression. As two officers wandered Charlie's house, taking photos and collecting anything they deemed evidence, a third asked me questions. It didn't take us long to arrive at a similar conclusion. Sandra had her heart set on Charlie's life insurance. She had likely been in and out of the house for days, stealing what she could and making plans to hasten Charlie's death. The daily pill organizer was a giveaway. I told the cops that I'd found it left open. The officer had me check that I had enough backup medicine for Charlie in the bottles that I kept in the bathroom cabinet, and then took the pill case. They suspected she'd been changing out Charlie's medication for something else. An ambulance was called, and Charlie was taken in for blood tests as a precaution. When my dad and I finally spoke later that night, he told me he'd never touched Charlie's computer, never read up on stroke medication or life expectancy. The internet searches were Sandra's clumsy attempt at plotting a murder. These grim details would more or less be confirmed as the whole mess tumbled into the light during the police investigation. It turned out that by blind luck, I had narrowly avoided feeding Charlie a strong opiate that could have killed him. Evidently, Sandra had been adding oxycodone to the pill case. The whole story was as tragic in the aftermath as it had been horrifying in the present. Sandra's life had spiraled viciously in recent years. Apparently, she'd made a series of attempts to separate Charlie from what money he had. By the time of his stroke, she'd grown tired of asking. and was ready to do something desperate. Ironically, my dad had been named sole beneficiary of the life insurance policy years before. However, it was clear that Sandra hadn't been residing entirely in reality for some time. I lived with Charlie, both of us relatively content, for the next 2 years, the last of Charlie's long life. I wouldn't trade that chapter of my early middle age for the world. When he passed, it was like losing my best friend. I think we nearly wore his Tom Waits record down to dust during those years. But through it all, we kept the closet door open.